Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Today I want to talk about a subject that I'm really excited to talk about. That is short video games or smaller experiences. Games that can be consumed in just a couple of days or so, and why I think they should be making a resurgence, especially in the more like Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo side of things, because we still see indie developers making games like this and coming out with really fantastic stuff. But I want to see a return to form from some of these other big corporations, because it seems like nowadays we just see these big AAA experiences. That's the main focus. We want to see games like Spider-Man, God of War, Halo, Gears of War. We want to see all these games always being pumped out into the gaming space instead of focusing on smaller titles as well, because that's the best way to bridge the gap between giant experiences that will take up a ton of your time. Now, I want to preface this by saying I'm not against big games. I love big games. Some of the Zelda titles like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are some of my favorites in the entire series, and I love pouring tons of time into a really detailed world full of fun things to do. I've been playing Hogwarts Legacy lately. The Witcher 3 is phenomenal. Cyberpunk 2077, now that it's got this new Phantom Liberty update and everything, there is a case to be made for longer experiences, and I don't want those to go away. I just want to see less of them, or at least more high quality ones if we're going to have a bunch of them, because it seems like nowadays long form experiences just seem to be very formulaic and have a bunch of busy work and don't really give you much bang for your buck, and I want more of that. And that's what I think short experiences do in video games. I've been playing a lot of Game Boy Advance games lately, and I've been having the time of my life. I can beat a Game Boy Advance game in just a couple of days, like 5-6 hours or so, and have a really enjoyable experience. I've been playing through the Castlevania games on Game Boy Advance. I really love the Metroid games there. Even the 2D Metroid games from the SNES era, they're also really good at making those shorter, more concise, and really like content-rich games that will really take up just a few hours of your time but leave you extremely satisfied as well. So I want to talk about those kind of experiences and why we don't see them nearly as much anymore. I loved when Nintendo was making these experiences on the Game Boy Advance specifically, because that was the perfect platform for shorter form content. Now that they have the Switch, and that's how a hybrid system, no like dedicated portable handheld like the Game Boy Advance, the DS, the 3DS, we don't see those smaller experiences unless they're coming from indie devs typically nowadays. Metroid Dread is the last one I can think of that they made that's just like a really content heavy but really short experience. I think I beat Metroid Dread in 5-6 hours, just like I did on the Game Boy Advance with Metroid Fusion, Metroid Zero Mission, the Castlevania games, and I really had a phenomenal time. It was one of my favorite games. It might have been my game of the year that year even. I just really enjoyed it. Every minute of my time was very, very enjoyable. That's what I love about this era of gaming. Like I said, I'm playing through the Castlevanias. Aria of Sorrow, I had pretty much an enjoyable time from start to finish, and I didn't want to put the game down. Every time I wanted to pick up a video game, I just picked up my Game Boy and played Aria of Sorrow instead. And it was great from start to finish. It made me also not want to play other games while I was in the middle of it. I usually have several projects going on at one time. Like I mentioned previously, I've got Hogwarts Legacy kind of on the back burner. I took a break from that to finish Dead Space. I want to talk about that one very soon. I typically have a few things going all at once. But with these shorter experiences that I know are going to be shorter but really fulfilling and rewarding, I tend to just dive right in and get every bit of enjoyment I can out of it going from start to finish. So I'm not interrupted by anything. I just have this game to play. And that's what I love about them specifically. SNES era also had plenty of these titles, plenty of bigger ones too. A Link to the Past kind of fits both sides of the story, because Link to the Past is a smallish title, but bigger for like the Super Nintendo era, but you can complete it in not a super long amount of time. That's why it was a great fit when it got ported over to the Game Boy Advance. Other games like WarioWare were perfect for this platform because it gave you these little micro games and a fun little story to follow that's really enjoyable, all these mini games. I really enjoyed stuff like that, and I look back at the Game Boy Advance era with so much positivity. I think of all the games that I played on it, and I had so much fun using that handheld. Think about the Pokemon games that were all really fantastic on that. Even like tie-in video games for like TV shows and movies were actually phenomenal for the Game Boy Advance platform. A couple I can specifically think of was a Fairly Odd Parents game that was actually pretty darn fun, kind of arcade style-y, but gave you enough content. Again, like 3 or 4 hours once you got good at it, but it gave a nice gameplay loop. There was like a Shrek tie-in game about Puss in Boots that was actually pretty fun too. The Ed and Nettie game was great, like a weird like Metroidvania platformer. They just were really good at making these games in the style, and they could make a nice little platformer that didn't take up a ton of time or resources and pump something out that was really enjoyable, even if it was just a tie-in. Again, like I played this SpongeBob, I think it was the movie tie-in video game. Actually pretty darn good for the Game Boy Advance. This was an era where developers were not having to invest a ton of resources because the games were selling for cheaper than like retail price games on like the GameCube and the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. So they were like $30 experiences or $20 sometimes. So they're much smaller, so their budgets were smaller, and so they were just forced to make a nice, concise little adventure for you. And it just worked beautifully. And I wish that we'd see a return to this from the big developers, specifically from like Microsoft and Sony. Nintendo still does sometimes. Not all their games are big, content-heavy packages with open worlds and everything. They are typically making smaller games. When they do come out with the big ones, they're your 3D Marios and the 3D Zelda games. But they still come out with those bite-sized adventures that are still just so fun to play. I would like to see them make more of them. But for Microsoft, they with this recently when I talked about how they're closing down these big studios because they've been acquiring so many studios and they need to recoup on investments, so they're just trying to pump out the ones that are going to sell billions of dollars worth of revenue. And it's just sad to see because some of these smaller titles work so well. If you look at Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps, those are like extended small experiences. They're a little bit longer than what I'm talking about, the GBA era, but it's still exactly what I'm thinking of. These like Metroidvania style games are perfect for that. They don't take up a ton of your time, and they're so engrossing and so much fun. And they're, because of the design philosophy, they just are really easy to develop. I mean, I don't know about easy to develop, easy to like hit a home run off of these. I guess that's what I meant to say there. I'm sure they're very difficult to develop, but when you have a formula that really works and you put it out there, it's going to be received very well. Ori and Blind Forest and Will of the Wisp were so successful on Xbox, they ported them over to the Switch. I really enjoyed them. I had a great time with those platformers, and they were nice little bite-sized experiences. You could even argue something like Hi-Fi Rush, one of these smaller games that won awards and did very well on the console. Stuff like that is fantastic. We want to see more of that, especially bridging the gap between big releases. For Xbox specifically, they don't have a ton of big first-party releases on the horizon yet. I think they're doing a showcase pretty soon. They got Hellblade the Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 coming out pretty quick, but they need to bridge the gap between these big releases better. And what better way to do that than with all of the studios that you own? Build some smaller experiences that we can pay $20, $30 for, maybe $30, $40 for, and we'll absolutely eat them up as long as they're good. And if you have a team that knows what they're doing with these smaller experiences, that's the perfect way to utilize them. Sony's the same way. I mean, they have all these big blockbuster projects. You've got like Spider-Man 2 and God of War Ragnarok, The Last of Us Part 2, all these big budget games. But I would love to see more smaller games being made. I would love to see them utilize some of their studios and make some better, like, smaller projects in between the big releases. I miss the days when we were getting great platformers like the Crash Bandicoot series. And while that one isn't necessarily a small game, it's the same kind of style I'm thinking of. And I would love to see more like that. I would love to see Sony make a departure from the big budget games and give us some more smaller size stuff like they did on the Vita. I loved the Tearaway game. It was one of my favorites. It's still one of my favorite video games of all time. The Little Big Planet series was great for this. Now, it just seems like so many of these big publishers are making these giant experiences because they want to make as much money as possible, and I'm not going to fault them for wanting to make money, but you could make a lot of money on these small experiences too if you just divert some of those resources, maybe take some off of these big projects, make pull back the scope a little bit from these giant projects and give resources to a small team and have them make a small game while the other team's making the large game, then you have two things that you can be launching at the same time. You can launch the small game in between big releases, or do that with several different of your studios, and then we have more great games being made by great developers. I think that's what I want to see from the near future of gaming. I'd love to see these more bite-sized experiences that I can really just fully enjoy, just a few hours, really be satisfied at the end of my meal and be like, yeah, that was fantastic. That will absolutely tide me over until the next big release. And if the game's good enough, like Metroid Dread, I immediately jumped back in for a hard mode playthrough because it was just so fun. I had such a great time. I wanted to have some more, and it's fantastic. I just love when studios make really well thought out games that don't take up a ton of time, don't take up a ton of your time, I mean, the consumer's time to play, because there's so many big open world games at this point vying for your attention, these big live service experiences that want to suck every bit of time out of you and every bit of your money as well with microtransactions, and I just really would like to see a return to that era, so we have a good mix of both, so that the big games coming out are worth your time instead of just being in a sea of other big titles that are being released. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I've just been really enjoying the GBA era, so I'm going to be doing more of those reviews pretty soon. I'm finishing up Circle of the Moon, so I want to talk about those ones in the near future. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.